discuss the Russian-Finnish War, the Winter War to be precise. Now, the Winter War only lasted 105 days, but it saw the death and injured of 500,000 Russian soldiers and 60,000 injured and killed Finnish soldiers. Yet it's rarely discussed. Let us discuss why it's more important. The Russian-Finnish War has a pretty rich history behind it, and it's quite fascinating on how this event unfolded. Now, to discuss my point, I'm going to be using many scholarly sources. Let me read some off for you. My main scholarly source that I'll be using is The Winter War by Ethan Beck. But I'll be driving more in depth into my opinions and circumstances of the Winter War with such scholarly sources as The Red Army in the Second World War, written by A.M. Nikolovsky. The Origins of the Winter War, a study of Russo-Finnish diplomacy by Albin Anderson. And Forgotten Footnotes of the Second World War by James Phillips. And maybe, if you're lucky, we'll discuss Winter War and Estonian neutrality. Now, it's interesting that we don't discuss the Winter War as much as we do, given it has such a large impact on Hitler's decision on leading into Operation Barbarossa, and has a much larger scale and importance to World War II than most people give it credit for. Now I know you're thinking, Michael, that's a pretty big claim saying Operation Barbarossa was directly linked to the Winter War, but throughout this essay, I think I'm going to give out some pretty good information that's going to lead you to think, hey, that guy in the tweed suit, he's onto something. Now, just for clarifications, Operation Barbarossa was going to happen, but I do think the lead up to the Winter War does play a key effect on why Hitler decided to go in and invade Russia after the Winter War. Now, to get a better reason on why this whole Winter War thing happened, I think we gotta look back, way back, into Russian-Finnish relations, and trust me, there's some juicy details in that there pot. Now, the relationship between Russia and Finland leading up to the Russian-Finnish War, the Winter War to be precise, it wasn't really the most clean and well-cut relationship. Ever since Russia decided to do the whole communism thing, Finland and Russia have been hard opposed to each other. Because back in the olden days, like Tsar Nicholas kind of days, Finland actually used to be a part of Russia. It was kind of like its own nation-state kind of thing, but it was still controlled by Russia. But after the whole fall of the Tsar and him going away, Finland didn't really want to adopt communism, but lo and behold, Russia, it was really jonesing for that communism. Now, Finland was able to oppose the Russian Revolution in 1917, but then shortly after, in 1920, lo and behold, the Russians are at it again, and a communist revolution started up between the whites of Finland and the Reds, known as the Communists. But in 1920, they were able to stave off this attack as well, but they used help from Germany. Now, it won't be the last time Germany is showing up in this here video essay. Just wait and see. After the 1920 failed Russian Revolution thing in Finland, they decided to write up a whole little treaty called the Treaty of Pact, which divided Finland and Russia. Now, neither of them were too keen on this whole arrangement, because Finland, they were like, ooh, you guys are getting too much land from us, and then Russia was like, oh, the fact that we are giving you land in general, that's a damn shame. Now, the problem that Russians had with the Treaty of Pact was that the border between Finland and Russia were so close to Leningrad that it was like, ooh boy, I don't like them being that close. So, nobody's really a big fan of this whole deal, and it's going to come up later when the spark of the Winter War sets off because, let me tell you, nobody wants a exposed Leningrad out there, and the Russians are fixing to change that. Now, Lenin really wanted Finland to adopt communism because he was a big fan of it himself, but was unable to expend too many resources trying to push communism into Finland and trying to get communism to spread all throughout there. Then, after he died, Stalin took over, and let me tell you, he had a little bit less of a chill, relaxed notion towards spreading communism into Finland. Now these kerfuffles led us into the more closer to Winter War years. And the next key point we're going to be talking about is the Nazi-Soviet pact that the Nazis and the Soviets made a pact about. Now, this pact contained the fact that they were dividing up territories throughout Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So, if the Germans were to attack Poland, you won't see the Russians complaining, no, 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 because the Germans wouldn't argue if the Russians went in and took Finland from the Finnish. But, can you really trust the Nazis? That's the good question here, because we're going to learn later on. The Nazis really weren't holding up their end of the bargain. The Russians saw that coming. Now this Russian-Soviet pact thing is kind of interesting, because if you remember closely from last time we talked about the whole Finnish and Russian and German relationship, the Finnish and the Germans, they seem to be getting along a bit better than the Finnish and the Russians. So it's kind of interesting that they were willing to go, yeah, you can take Finland if we can take Poland, but this also kind of leads to another key point. That Russia was like, yeah, you can go ahead and take Poland, and then Germans took it. They just freaking took that thing. But this then created a time clock on the Russians to be like, oh man, now we gotta take Finland. Oh geez. Which, like, they want to take Finland, don't get me wrong, but if they don't do it quick enough, that can make them look way too weak compared to those Germans that were like going around taking Poland. Now, the Winter War didn't start off with a big bang where the Russians were like, ooh, let's go invade Finland now. On our way to invade Finland. No, instead they sat down with Finland and really tried to talk out how they were going to take just a small part of Finland. You know why? Because they were saying they wanted to keep Finland safe from the Germans. Ooh. Now, part of this negotiation, Stalin came in and was like, hey, we want to station soldiers at specific military bases because we think the Germans are going to come in and be like, hey, we want those military bases, but don't worry, the Russians are already holding those bases. And they also wanted to push the border away from Leningrad and right up to the Mannerheim, which is like this important strategic location because, let me tell you, from Finland to Leningrad, it's all flat sails. It's just a smooth ship going straight to their city. That's how Stalin was negotiating this whole, we're going to occupy Finland, don't worry bud, it's going to be fine approach was, he was going to be like, hey, we're going to put soldiers in some of your major bases throughout Finland. And then we also really want to move that border that's really close to Leningrad, we're going to move it all the way down to that Mannerheim. Because, honestly, Stalin, he really didn't like the fact that that border was so close to Leningrad. Also, he just really wanted some Finland. Now, Finland was like, whoa, we don't want you occupying our bases and moving our borders. Because why would we be threatened by the Germans if they just helped us in the 20s to stop you guys from spreading communism to our lands? So, the Finnish people kind of saw it as, why don't we just align ourselves with the Germans? Why would we align ourselves with the Russians, the guys we've been at war with prior to this? So, after failed negotiations to get Russia to occupy Finland, Russia was like, oh no man, are we looking weak on a global scale. So this led to them thinking, oh geez, Germans are already taking Poland, so we gotta start thinking more, we gotta take Finland. So on November 30th, 1939, they invaded Finland. This was the beginning of the Winter War. Now, something quite bizarre that I read in one of these scholarly journals was that Finland was initially surprised that the Russians were going to invade them, and then the Russians were equally surprised, thinking, oh man, why are these Finnish guys putting up so much resistance? But it's kind of interesting why Finland did believe, oh, why would Russia invade us? Finland did start to mobilize troops after seeing Estonia start to get occupied in October. But they didn't actually expect to go into conflict with Russia because they're thinking, oh, the Germans, they're going to come in and they're going to fight Russia way before we're going to have to fight Russia. But they failed to realize that there was a secret plan between the whole Nazis and Soviets called the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the thing we discussed earlier. The Finnish didn't know about that. Now, Stalin was surprised at how much resistance Finland put up. He was thinking, oh, we're going to cruise right on through there. It's going to be just like Poland 2.0, baby. We're going to take you guys in 12 days. It's going to be great. But no, that did not happen. That war went on for 105 days, and they made like 75 kilometers in actual progress. Now, let's get on to the whole Winter War. Ooh, baby. It's a hot one. The Finnish people, they haven't really seen much combat. So they're very surprised that they're able to hold their own against the Russian soldiers, who, let's face it, has seen a lot more combat. But, given the fact that they had ski shooters, better ways to mobilize their way through their thick snow, better camouflage, and they had better knowledge of the terrain since they're the country that's defending themselves and not the ones they're attacking, they were actually able to hold off the Russians. Now, Finland had this whole really good strategy thing going on for them. They would let the Russians move into Finland, and they would get up real close to that whole Mannerheim. But then they would kind of block them in and start wiping them out. And they kept on just doing that. This led to so many more Russians dying compared to the Finns, because, hey, those Finns, they really got some clever thinking going on when it comes to war. One of the things that really did not help the whole we're going to war thing is that in 1937, Stalin was like, hey, I want to purge a bunch of my military commanders. That seems smart. And let me tell you, doing that and then just going into a war? Ooh, baby. That's a recipe for disaster. The main reason why that's a recipe for disaster, you got an uneducated and untrained and just outright non-experienced military that's about to go to war. Now here's the insane part. Even with all that great strategy working for them, after 105 days of fighting, Finland decided to sign a peace treaty ending this winter war, which is insane on surface level. But let's get into the details and why it may make a little bit more sense for those clever Finnish soldiers. One of the reasons why the Finnish decided to end the war is those pesky Germans came in and were like, hey, if you end the war now, we're going to invade Russia, and then we're going to help you resupply, so then you, the Finnish people, can retake the land that Russians took from you. Because up until this point, the Russians did make it up to Mannerheim, and did take many key bases, even though they lost 500,000 men to death and or injury. So, with this whole, oh, Germans are gonna come back for us later on and help us take out those pesky Russians, they were like, okay, let's sign the Russian treaty, give them the 75 kilometers-ish that they've taken, and hope the Germans will come back later and really help us out in that manner. The Finnish only lost about 60,000 men to death and or life-threatening injuries. You know what's even more insane than the Finnish going, hey, we're going to end this war early by signing a peace treaty even though we're taking out way more of your guys, is that the Russians were like, yeah, we won. That's absurd if you think about it. They lost 500,000 able-bodied men. And they're like, yippee! We're the winners! Now if you're thinking losing 500,000 men and not even being able to take the country that you just invaded is an odd time to say, yeah, we declare victory, you'd be right. You'd also be agreeing with the Nazis. Now the Germans didn't see this as a victory. Instead, they saw it as a sign of weakness from the Russians, showing that their leadership is lacking when it comes to war. And when it comes to communism in general, because let me tell you, those Nazis were not a fan of communism. To quote Hitler, on his views on what it's going to be like to invade Russia after the Winter War, he said, to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would come down. Other prominent Nazis like Albert Speers also discussed the opinions of Hitler when it came to the failures towards taking Finland during the Winter War. That, quote, that this only proved Hitler's beliefs that Russia was weak. Now, you can look at this through a Russian's perspective though, because this is only a precursor to what will happen in World War II. Stalin lost 500,000 able-bodied men just to take 75 kilometers of land. Now, if we look at how World War II turned out, he threw millions upon millions of men just to retake German-occupied Russia. Their whole strategy, a large portion of their strategy, had to come up with overcoming terrible leadership by just throwing people at the problem. They were willing to sacrifice 500,000 men and take 75 kilometers and be like, yeah, we won. That's an insane premise to take from a war, but that's how they saw it. They were willing to take as much damage as possible if it meant they were able to retake land that they saw was theirs. A major reason why the Winter War ended was it wasn't sustainable for the Finnish people. Even though they were losing only 1 to every 10 Russians they killed, they were still losing a large portion of their population to this war, and there was no clear sign that the Russians were going to give up anytime soon, and they would just keep sending men. It's a complete scorched earth, win or die kind of strategy, which they continued to use during World War II. Hitler was able to recognize that the Russian army has terrible tactics, and they were like, oh man, those Russians sure are weak because they don't know how to organize their military, which granted, that's really important to be able to do. But they didn't account on the fact that Russians are still just willing to throw countless people at a problem until it goes away. Hitler used the Winter War to justify his beliefs that the Russians were weak and it's a good time to invade the Russians because, oh man, if they failed to fight the Finns, ooh boy, let me show you some Nazis. But he didn't learn from the fact that a major reason why they were able to take those 75 kilometers from the Finnish was they were willing to sacrifice 500,000 men. There's pretty good evidence to show that Hitler, after observing the Winter War and seeing the Russians lose to the Finnish army would believe that, oh man, if we launch Operation Barbarossa, they're going to have to contend with the Nazis. And they were much better at tactics than the Finnish because they were more seasoned soldiers. So he was probably thinking, we're going to easily be able to take Moscow, given the fact that the Russians weren't even able to take Finland. But he ignored one of the major factors of the Finnish War, is that the Russians were just willing to throw people constantly at the Finnish. And they did the exact same thing in World War II. Operation Barbarossa may have been a success at first, being able to push into the Russian territory. But Stalin repeated what he did in the Winter War and just threw people at it. And threw millions upon millions of soldiers at World War II just to defeat the Nazis.